The sun had just begun to rise over the quiet lake, painting the water with soft streaks of gold and pink. Birds were waking up, calling to each other from the trees that lined the shore, and a light mist hovered over the surface, giving the whole place a magical, almost dreamlike feeling. At the heart of this calm scene stood a small, charming cabin, its wooden walls reflecting the gentle sunlight. This was the home of the protagonist, a person who had always sought peace and simplicity over the busyness of city life. They loved every detail of this lakeside haven, from the way the wind whispered through the pine trees to the small garden behind the cabin that bloomed with wildflowers every spring. Life here was slow and deliberate. Every morning began with the same comforting routine. The protagonist would step outside onto the small porch, cup of tea in hand, and breathe in the fresh, crisp air. Ducks floated lazily on the water, occasionally diving beneath the surface, and the occasional fish would make a splash, breaking the quiet of the morning. It was a perfect rhythm of life, one that allowed for reflection and calm. The protagonist had always valued these moments of solitude, the kind of moments that city life rarely offered. It was in these quiet hours that they felt most connected to the world around them, most themselves. Despite living in such a peaceful place, the protagonist had neighbors nearby. They were friendly enough, waving from their own cabins or stopping for brief chats when passing by. None of the neighbors were close enough to visit every day, but the occasional conversation added a sense of community without intruding on the protagonist's need for privacy. It was a delicate balance, and one the protagonist had come to cherish. There were no conflicts, no loud parties, no unnecessary rules, just a simple understanding that everyone was here for the beauty of the lake and the calm that came with it. But tranquility, as it often does, has a way of being interrupted. A short distance from the protagonist's cabin was the local homeowners association, a small office that handled rules, complaints, and the occasional dispute among the lakeside property owners. For the most part, the HOA was harmless. They made sure everyone followed basic guidelines like keeping their lawns tidy or maintaining their docks. Most neighbors respected the rules, and life continued smoothly. That is, until one particular neighbor, who the protagonist and others would soon come to refer to as HOA Karen, began to take an interest in the protagonist's property. She was the type of person who liked control, someone who thrived on making sure everyone followed every small rule perfectly. At first it was subtle. She would walk past the protagonist's cabin and make a small disapproving noise. If the garden wasn't perfectly arranged or if the dock had a stray leaf on it, she would comment to other neighbors about minor things, always in a way that made it clear she was watching. The protagonist noticed her, of course, but mostly ignored her. There was no harm in a little curiosity, after all, and they had no interest in confrontation. For weeks, life continued normally. The protagonist spent mornings on the porch, afternoons walking along the shore, and evenings reading by the fireplace, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the dock. They would sometimes take a small rowboat out on the lake, letting the quiet envelop them completely. These were the kinds of days that made life feel full, even without much excitement. The sun would rise and set, the birds would sing, and the water would shimmer in the fading light. Every day felt like a gift, one the protagonist had worked hard to find by moving to this secluded spot. But it was during one of these quiet mornings that things began to shift. HOA Karen had decided to address what she saw as a problem. She approached the protagonist while they were tending to their small garden, her steps quick and purposeful, her expression firm. "You can't be here," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the kind of authority she expected would be obeyed automatically. "This area is private. You need to leave." The protagonist paused, straightening up and setting down the watering can. They looked at her calmly, noticing for the first time just how serious she seemed. "I'm not sure what you mean," they said politely. "This is my cabin. I've lived here for some time and I believe everything is in order." HOA Karen's eyes narrowed. She had expected resistance, of course, but she had not expected such calm. Most people, she thought, would have become flustered or apologetic. "No," she said firmly. "I'm telling you, you don't belong here. The rules are clear and you're breaking them." The protagonist nodded slightly, choosing their words carefully. "I understand you feel that way, but I've checked the property records and my ownership is clear. I have the right to be here. If there's an issue, perhaps we can review the documents together." HOA Karen hesitated for a brief moment, clearly unprepared for this level of knowledge. But her confidence returned quickly, as if she could not allow anyone to contradict her. "I'm calling this in," she said, reaching for her phone. "The authorities will sort this out." For the protagonist, this was unexpected but not frightening. They knew they had done nothing wrong. The peaceful life they had built over years was based on respect, careful planning, and adherence to the law. They had nothing to fear from someone's misunderstanding or stubborn insistence about rules. Still, there was a moment of tension. They could feel the energy shift around them, the lake suddenly seeming more alive as if it sensed the disturbance. The neighbors began to notice the commotion. Some peeked from their porches, curious about the raised voices. Others stopped their morning walks, trying to understand what had caused the rare disruption. The protagonist remained calm, standing on the porch and watching as HOA Karen made her call. There was no yelling, no threats, no aggressive behavior, just the quiet certainty that things were about to take a strange turn. As HOA Karen spoke on the phone, explaining her complaint in meticulous detail, the protagonist reflected on how unusual it was to have someone so focused on control. They thought about all the mornings spent enjoying the quiet, the small rituals that made their life full, and the sense of connection they felt to the lake and the surrounding land. This intrusion was sudden, almost absurd in its intensity, yet it offered a strange opportunity to see human behavior in its raw form. By the time the call ended, the protagonist had a sense of what was coming next. They knew the authorities would arrive soon, and with them a chance to clarify the situation fully. They were ready to remain calm, to explain clearly and to show that their life here was legitimate and peaceful. They took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh lake air, letting the scent of pine and water fill their lungs. In that moment, they felt certain that truth and patience would prevail. No matter how insistent HOA Karen might be, the sun continued to climb, the ducks swam lazily, and the water shimmered in a way that made the entire world seem serene and untroubled. The protagonist stood on the porch, a quiet figure of calm in the midst of someone else's storm, ready to face what would come next. This was their home, their sanctuary, and no misunderstanding or overzealous neighbor could take that away. And so the day began, not with conflict, but with quiet determination. The protagonist prepared to meet the unexpected, to handle the situation with patience and clarity, and to continue enjoying the beauty of the lake and the life they had worked so hard to create. Little did they know, this small encounter would set the stage for revelations and events far beyond what anyone, including HOA Karen, could have imagined. The morning air remained crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth, even as the sun climbed higher over the lake. The protagonist had already sensed the shift in the atmosphere, a subtle tension that had been absent in the days and weeks before. Life at the cabin had always been calm and predictable, yet now there was a sense that things were about to change, and the source of this change was none other than the overzealous HOA Karen. After her initial confrontation, HOA Karen had not retreated, as the protagonist had hoped she might. Instead, she seemed to double down, patrolling the area near the cabin with an air of authority that was both irritating and somewhat comical. She walked past the dock, peered into the windows, and even made pointed comments about the arrangement of the garden, which had never bothered anyone before. Her eyes would narrow at the sight of anything she deemed imperfect, as if she were a guardian of some invisible law that only she could enforce. The protagonist, meanwhile, maintained their usual routine. They moved with calm efficiency, tending to the garden, checking the small vegetable patches, and sweeping the porch. The ducks swam lazily in the lake, unaware of the tension that seemed to hang in the air. The gentle lapping of water against the shore remained unchanged, a steady reminder that some things in life were unaffected by human fussiness. Despite HOA Karen's presence, the protagonist refused to let her disturbance disrupt the quiet and meditative rhythm of their day. Still, there was an awareness that something more serious could happen. HOA Karen had been making small remarks to other neighbors, subtly gathering attention and perhaps allies. She implied that the protagonist was violating rules, though she never explained which rules exactly. Her tone suggested urgency, as though she alone had the ability to determine right and wrong, while the protagonist could only politely disagree. This created a ripple of curiosity among the surrounding residents. Some peeked from their porches, whispering to one another, while others paused during their morning walks, trying to make sense of the unusual confrontation. The protagonist decided to handle the situation with a combination of patience and clarity. They walked to the edge of the property, greeting neighbors with a smile, and casually explained their understanding of the property boundaries. "I've checked the records," they said gently, "and everything is properly documented. This is my cabin and my land. I have every right to be here, just as you have every right to your own homes." Their calmness seemed to contrast sharply with HOA Karen's intensity, and some neighbors began to quietly admire the protagonist's composed approach. But HOA Karen was not easily deterred. Later that day she returned, this time carrying a clipboard and a stack of papers, clearly prepared to argue her case more formally. She approached the protagonist with a brisk step and a determined expression. "You need to leave," she said again without any greeting or small talk. "I've checked with the HOA, you're violating the rules." The protagonist listened patiently, nodding. "I understand that you feel strongly about this," they replied. "But as I mentioned before, the property records confirm that I have full rights here. Perhaps we could review the documents together so there's no confusion." HOA Karen's frustration seemed to grow. She waved the papers in the air as if that alone could enforce authority. "I've explained it to you clearly," she said, her voice tight with impatience. "You're in the wrong. You can't be here. I'm calling this in if you don't leave immediately." The protagonist remained calm, sensing that any aggressive reaction could escalate the situation unnecessarily. They smiled politely and gestured toward the lake. "Please, feel free to make your call. I have nothing to hide, and I trust that the proper authorities will see the facts clearly. HOA." Karen's eyes narrowed, her confidence flickering for a moment. She had expected immediate compliance, perhaps even fear, yet the protagonist's calm demeanor disrupted her expectations. She stepped back slightly, glancing around, aware that neighbors were beginning to notice the interaction. Some of them had paused in their routines, watching silently as the confrontation unfolded. The protagonist's quiet confidence stood in stark contrast to HOA Karen's flustered determination, creating an almost theatrical tension that the neighborhood had not seen before. As the afternoon sun warmed the lake, the protagonists continued their work, tending to the cabin as if nothing unusual were happening. They mended a small section of the dock, swept the porch, and even prepared a simple lunch, all while keeping a watchful eye on HOA Karen, who remained nearby, fuming but unable to take decisive action. The protagonist's presence was calm, steady, and unshakable, showing that one could face conflict without surrendering to it. The neighbors, intrigued by the ongoing situation, began to quietly discuss what they were witnessing. Some were sympathetic to the protagonist, noting how reasonable and polite they were, while others seemed unsure, caught between HOA Karen's insistence and the protagonist's composed explanations. Conversations were hushed, whispers of curiosity spreading through the Lakeside community. It became clear that HOA Karen's attempts to assert control were not going unnoticed, and her behavior was starting to affect her own reputation among those who valued fairness and calm. Meanwhile, the protagonist took a moment to reflect. They thought about the peace and quiet they had found at this lake, the long mornings spent watching the water, and the simple joy of being connected to nature. It was precisely this love for the lakeside life that gave them patience and perspective. While HOA Karen's urgency and insistence were annoying, they were ultimately inconsequential in the grander scheme of life. The protagonist understood that conflict often arose from misunderstanding or a desire for control, and that maintaining calm was the most effective way to handle it. As evening approached, HOA Karen made one final attempt. She returned with a more serious expression, clearly determined to escalate the situation further. She demanded that the protagonist leave immediately, citing vague rules and authority that she claimed to have. The protagonist listened carefully, acknowledging her words without defensiveness. "I hear your concern," they said softly. "But as I've mentioned, the property is legally mine. I'm happy to review the documents with you or with any authorities you wish to involve. There is no reason for conflict if we all follow the facts." This response seemed to confuse HOA Karen, who had expected anger or fear, not quiet confidence. She paused, her determination wavering slightly. The protagonist's calmness was disarming, revealing the absurdity of the situation without needing to say so directly. For the first time, HOA Karen hesitated, unsure of how to proceed when confronted with reason rather than resistance. Neighbors continued to watch from a distance, some shaking their heads in disbelief at HOA Karen's insistence, while others whispered their admiration for the protagonist's patience. The protagonist, aware of the growing audience, remained composed, knowing that their behavior spoke louder than words. The lake shimmered in the fading sunlight, reflecting the peace that the protagonist had worked so hard to maintain, even in the midst of conflict. Finally, as the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, HOA Karen seemed to realize that her immediate attempts were failing. She retreated for the day, muttering under her breath about rules and authority, but without taking any decisive action. The protagonist watched her leave, feeling a quiet sense of relief. There had been no need for anger, confrontation, or escalation. Simply patience, calmness, and clarity had allowed the day to end without chaos. As night fell over the lake, the protagonist stood on the porch once more, listening to the soft sounds of water lapping against the dock and the occasional call of a nightbird. The tension of the day had passed, replaced by the familiar peace of their surroundings. They reflected on the events with a mixture of amusement and calm satisfaction, knowing that they had handled the situation correctly. Life at the lake had been interrupted, but it had not been diminished. The protagonist also considered the future. They knew HOA Karen would likely return, perhaps with renewed determination, but they felt prepared. With knowledge of the property, awareness of their rights, and the patience cultivated through years of lakeside living, they were confident they could face any further attempts at disruption. The day had been a test, and they had passed it with grace. By the time the stars began to appear in the night sky, reflecting faintly on the still surface of the lake, the protagonist had returned to their normal evening routine. A small fire burned in the fireplace, the smell of wood and warmth filling the cabin. They prepared a simple dinner, enjoying the quiet and the solitude that had always been their most cherished companion. Outside, the moonlight danced on the water, the gentle ripples creating a sense of timeless peace. In the end, the day was remembered not for conflict but for calmness, patience, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing one's rights and living in harmony with nature. The protagonist had faced an unexpected challenge and had emerged unshaken, a testament to the power of composure, respect, and clear understanding. And although HOA Karen had stirred the waters of the lake that day, the true serenity of the cabin remained untouched, ready to welcome the protagonist to another peaceful morning. The morning arrived with a gentle mist hovering over the lake, giving the familiar scenery an ethereal, almost dreamlike quality. The protagonist, as usual, started the day with their quiet routine. They stepped out onto the porch, stretched, and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The gentle sound of water lapping against the dock filled the silence, accompanied by the soft calls of birds waking up in the trees. Everything seemed normal at first glance, yet an undercurrent of tension lingered in the air. HOA Karen had not been seen since the previous day, but the protagonist could feel that today might bring another challenge. As the protagonist tended to the small garden behind the cabin, carefully watering the flowers and vegetables, they noticed a familiar figure approaching from the narrow gravel path that led to the cabin. HOA Karen's expression was more determined than ever. In her hands, she held a cell phone and a notebook, clearly prepared to escalate the ongoing dispute. The protagonist straightened and watched, choosing to remain calm and unbothered by the approaching storm. Without any greeting or small talk, HOA Karen spoke in a firm voice. "I've called the authorities," she said. "They're on their way. You need to leave before they arrive." The protagonist listened quietly, letting her words hang in the air without reaction. "I understand," they said softly. "I trust that the authorities will review the facts and see that everything is in order here. I have nothing to hide." Their calmness seemed to frustrate HOA Karen even more, but she made the call anyway, speaking rapidly into the phone and describing her complaint in precise detail. Within minutes, a vehicle appeared on the narrow road that led to the cabin. 2 officers stepped out, professional and neutral, carrying notepads and radios. They walked toward the cabin with measured steps, their expressions showing no immediate judgment, only curiosity and attentiveness. The protagonist greeted them politely, explaining that they were the owner of the cabin and the surrounding land, and that there had been a disagreement with a neighbor. The officers nodded and began asking questions. HOA Karen, standing nearby, spoke urgently. "They're trespassing," she said. "They have no right to be here. This area is private property under the HOA's control, and I demand that they leave immediately." The protagonist remained composed. "I understand your concern," they replied. "However, the property records confirm that I am the legal owner of this cabin and the surrounding land. I am happy to provide documents or answer any questions to clarify this." The officers exchanged glances and then turned to the protagonist. "Could we see the documents?" one asked politely. The protagonist nodded and retrieved the property deeds, showing them clearly and calmly. The officers examined the paperwork carefully, taking notes and asking a few clarifying questions about boundaries, ownership, and prior transactions. HOA Karen hovered nearby, frowning and muttering, clearly frustrated that the situation was not resolving in her favor. As the officers reviewed the documents, neighbors began to gather at a respectful distance, curious about the unusual scene unfolding by the lake. Some whispered to each other, expressing disbelief at HOA Karen's insistence, while others quietly admired the protagonist's calm and collected approach. The air was filled with tension, but also a sense of anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for the moment when the truth would become clear. After carefully checking the property records, the officers returned to the protagonist and spoke in measured tones. "Everything appears to be in order," one said. "These documents confirm that you own this cabin and the surrounding land. There is no reason for you to leave. The neighbor's complaint seems to be based on a misunderstanding of the property boundaries." HOA. Karen's face turned red, a mix of embarrassment and anger. She tried to argue further, pointing at the lake, the dock, and the surrounding forest, insisting that she had authority over the area. The officers listened patiently but repeated that, according to the official records, the protagonist was well within their rights. HOA Karen's confidence began to falter, and she muttered something about rules under her breath before retreating a few steps, clearly unsure how to respond to the unexpected turn of events. The protagonist remained calm throughout, their demeanor steady and unshaken. They knew that confrontation would not help, and that patience, clarity, and respect for the authorities would ultimately show the truth. They spoke politely to the officers, answering questions and providing additional information about the boundaries and history of the property. With each explanation, it became more evident to everyone present that the protagonist had acted lawfully and had nothing to fear. Neighbors who had been watching began to whisper quietly among themselves. Some expressed admiration for how composed and reasonable the protagonist had been, handling what could have been a stressful situation with grace. Others simply shook their heads at HOA Karen's persistence, realizing that her attempts to control the situation were not only unnecessary but also misguided. The lake, calm and shimmering in the morning sun, seemed to mirror the protagonist's sense of peace, contrasting sharply with HOA Karen's frustration and agitation. The officers, having completed their review, spoke once more. "We understand that there was a complaint, but everything confirms that you are the rightful owner of this property. There is no legal reason for you to leave, and any further disputes should be resolved through proper channels such as the courts or the HOA's official meetings." HOA. Karen's shoulders slumped slightly. She seemed to realize that her authority had no power in this situation, and that her insistence had been unfounded. Still, she tried to salvage some sense of control, muttering about rules and regulations that did not apply. The officers nodded politely but made no further comment, clearly signaling that the matter was concluded. The protagonist thanked the officers, appreciating their professionalism and calm approach. "I'm grateful for your time," they said. "I hope this clears up any confusion and allows everyone to move forward peacefully." The officers nodded, returned to their vehicle, and drove away, leaving the protagonist and HOA Karen behind. For a brief moment, the lakeside was quiet again, as if holding its breath after the unusual commotion. HOA Karen finally turned and walked away, muttering angrily but without any further attempts to confront the protagonist. The neighbors, sensing the resolution, quietly returned to their routines, some offering nods or small waves of encouragement to the protagonist. The protagonist, once again alone, took a deep breath and looked out over the lake. The water reflected the soft glow of the morning sun, and the gentle sounds of nature returned to fill the air. There was a sense of relief but also a quiet satisfaction in having handled the situation with calm and dignity. The events of the day had shown that patience, knowledge, and respect for the truth could overcome misunderstanding and misplaced authority. As they returned to their cabin, the protagonist reflected on the unexpected challenge. HOA Karen had brought tension and disruption, but she had also provided an opportunity to demonstrate composure and clarity in the face of conflict. The protagonist realized that this moment, while unusual, reinforced the values that had drawn them to the lakeside life in the first place: serenity, patience, and a deep connection to the world around them. The day continued with a sense of calm restored. The protagonist tended to the garden, prepared a simple lunch, and later rowed the small boat across the sparkling water, feeling the gentle breeze on their face. Every detail of the lake, the ripples of water, the calls of birds, the reflections of trees, reminded them why they had chosen this place for their home. HOA Karen's interference, brief as it was, could not disturb the deeper peace that had been cultivated over years of quiet living. By evening, the protagonist had settled back onto the porch, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the hills. The lake was bathed in soft shades of orange and pink, the surface shimmering like liquid gold. Ducks swam lazily, the breeze rustled the leaves, and the cabin itself seemed to breathe in the tranquility that had returned. In that moment, the protagonist felt a renewed appreciation for their home, for the ability to handle challenges with calm, and for the simple joy of being surrounded by beauty and nature. The events of the morning, while surprising and a little stressful, had ended without conflict or confrontation. The protagonist knew that HOA Karen might return, but they felt confident in their ability to remain composed and to handle any future disputes with clarity and patience. The lake, once again serene, mirrored the protagonist's sense of calm, offering reassurance that life could continue undisturbed despite the occasional disturbance. As stars began to appear in the night sky, twinkling softly over the calm waters, the protagonist reflected on the day with a mixture of gratitude and quiet amusement. HOA Karen's call to 911 had seemed like a serious threat, but it had only reinforced the protagonist's understanding of their rights, their patience, and the value of remaining composed. The lake, as always, offered a sense of timeless peace, and the cabin provided a sanctuary that no misunderstanding or misdirected authority could disturb. The morning after the 911 incident began quietly, with the lake shrouded in a soft mist. The protagonist stepped onto the porch, taking in the familiar view, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Neighbors had been whispering about the events of the previous day, and HOA Karen's disappearance only fueled curiosity. The protagonist, however, remained calm, knowing that the truth about their property was about to come to light in a way that would settle any remaining misunderstandings. It began with a simple phone call. The protagonist had been reviewing old property documents, curious about the history of the land and the lake, when they noticed a detail they had not paid much attention to before. The property deeds showed not only ownership of the cabin and the immediate land surrounding it, but also included rights extending across the lake and even into the larger area of the county. The revelation was astonishing. It seemed that their peaceful lakeside retreat was part of a much larger ownership than they had realized, a fact that had somehow been obscured over the years. With a mix of amusement and satisfaction, the protagonist decided to verify the documents further. They contacted the county records office requesting official confirmation. Within hours, the records were reviewed, and the truth became undeniable. The protagonist legally owned a substantial portion of the surrounding land, including not just the lake and nearby cabins, but a significant portion of the county itself. It was a revelation that completely reframed the previous conflicts with HOA Karen. Later that day, HOA Karen returned, clearly determined to assert her authority once again. She strode toward the protagonist's cabin with a brisk step, her expression set in the kind of determination that had caused so much tension before. "I told you this area isn't yours," she said firmly. "You need to leave. You have no rights here." The protagonist listened calmly, their demeanor unshaken. "I understand that you feel strongly," they replied, smiling slightly. "However, as you may not know, I actually own much of the surrounding area, including this lake and the lands nearby. Everything here is legally mine, HOA. Karen blinked, her confidence faltering for the first time. That's impossible, she said, her voice shaky. I've checked the rules. I know the HOA controls this area. The protagonist shook their head gently. I have documentation that confirms my ownership. The county records clearly show my legal rights over this land. Your authority as a representative of the HOA does not extend here. They held out the official documents for HOA Karen to see, neatly arranged and clearly labeled HOA. Karen stared at the papers, disbelief written across her face. She shuffled through them, muttering under her breath, trying to find some flaw or loophole, but there was none. Every line, every signature, and every stamp confirmed that the protagonist was indeed the rightful owner. The authority she had assumed was hers was nothing more than a misunderstanding of boundaries and ownership. Neighbors, who had been watching from a distance, began to gather. Word of the confrontation had spread quickly, and now they were curious to see the outcome. Some whispered excitedly to one another, while others simply watched, observing the dramatic contrast between HOA Karen's flustered agitation and the protagonist's calm composure. It was a spectacle, but one that reinforced the protagonist's quiet dignity. Karen tried to argue further, pointing to the lake, the docks, and the surrounding properties. Even if you own this cabin, you don't own all of this, she said, her voice rising slightly in frustration. The protagonist remained composed. The documents I have show exactly what I own. It's not just this cabin or the land immediately around it. It includes the lake, the surrounding area, and a significant portion of the county. I understand this may be surprising, but it is the truth. The realization seemed to hit HOA Karen in waves. Her posture slumped slightly, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and embarrassment. She had been so certain of her authority, so convinced that she could enforce the rules at will. Yet the facts now made it impossible for her to continue. She muttered something about misunderstanding and turned to leave, clearly unsure how to respond to the revelation. The neighbors, sensing the dramatic turn of events, began to react. Some expressed amazement, nodding and whispering about the surprising extent of the protagonist's ownership. Others laughed quietly, shaking their heads at HOA Karen's persistence in the face of undeniable evidence. The lake, still and shimmering under the morning sun, reflected the calm and quiet confidence of the protagonist, a stark contrast to the flustered energy of HOA Karen. The protagonist watched as HOA Karen walked away, muttering under her breath. There was no anger in their gaze, only a quiet satisfaction. They had not needed to shout, argue, or escalate the situation. Patience, knowledge of the law, and calm composure had been enough to reveal the truth. The lake and the land around it remained theirs, peaceful and undisturbed, ready to return to the serenity that had always defined life there. Later that afternoon, the protagonist took a small rowboat out onto the lake, letting the gentle ripples carry them across the water. The sun glinted off the surface, and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze created a symphony of natural sounds. As they drifted, they reflected on the events of the past few days. The confrontation with HOA Karen had been unexpected, even stressful, but it had also revealed a deeper truth. The protagonist's patience, respect for the law, and understanding of their rights were more powerful than anger or insistence. They rowed to a small island in the middle of the lake, a place they had always considered special, but had never fully explored. Standing on the shore, they looked around and realized the full extent of what they owned. The water stretching in every direction, the surrounding woods, and even the small cabins dotting the landscape. The scale of their property was staggering, but it also felt natural, a reward for years of careful planning, hard work, and respect for the land. When the protagonist returned to the cabin, neighbors were gathered once again, some curious, some eager to congratulate them quietly, and others simply observing. Conversations were soft and respectful, acknowledging the remarkable turn of events without any unnecessary drama. The protagonist greeted each neighbor with a polite nod or a warm smile, maintaining the calm and approachable demeanor that had earned their respect in the first place. HOA Karen did not return that day, and the protagonist was relieved but not surprised. The revelation of ownership had been overwhelming for her, a reminder that authority based on assumption rather than law had limits. The protagonist felt no need to gloat or celebrate loudly. The knowledge of their rights and the peaceful enjoyment of their property were enough. As evening approached, the lake glowed with the soft light of the setting sun. The ducks swam lazily, the gentle breeze whispered through the trees, and the water reflected the colors of the sky in shimmering patterns. The protagonist sat on the porch sipping tea and watched as the day slowly transitioned into night. The events of the past few days seemed almost surreal now, yet they had taught an important lesson: patience. Knowledge and calmness could overcome misunderstanding, miscommunication, and misplaced authority. The stars began to appear in the night sky, twinkling softly over the serene lake. The protagonist reflected on how unusual the past few days had been, but also how rewarding it was to handle conflict without losing composure. HOA Karen's insistence had created tension, but it had also highlighted the protagonist's ability to remain grounded, rational, and calm in the face of absurdity. The lake, ever constant, seemed to mirror their inner peace, a reflection of the strength and patience that had guided them through the challenge. As night deepened, the protagonist settled into the cabin, the gentle sounds of the lake and forest providing a comforting backdrop. They felt a renewed appreciation for the life they had built, a life of serenity, respect for the law, and connection to nature. HOA Karen's interference, while initially alarming, had ultimately been a reminder of the importance of knowing one's rights and approaching every situation with calm determination. The protagonist allowed themselves a quiet smile, reflecting on the day's events with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. The lake, the cabin, and the surrounding land were theirs, peaceful and secure, and ready to continue offering the tranquility that had drawn them to this place in the first instance. The revelation of full ownership was not just about property. It was a confirmation that patience, clarity, and respect for truth could overcome conflict without confrontation. And so, as the night settled over the lake, the protagonist felt a sense of calm fulfillment. The confrontation with HOA Karen had been resolved not with force or anger, but with quiet knowledge and composure. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, the stars reflected in the still water, and the cabin remained a sanctuary of peace and serenity, fully theirs and ready for many more days of quiet, undisturbed life. The morning air over the lake was calm and soft, as if the world itself had settled into a gentle rhythm after the events of the past few days. The protagonist woke early, as they always did, and stepped onto the porch to take in the familiar view. The water shimmered under the rising sun. Birds called softly from the trees, and the occasional ripple of a fish breaking the surface added to the quiet symphony of nature. Life had returned to its serene pace, and the tension that had hung over the lake felt like a distant memory. The protagonist began their day as usual, tending to the garden and performing small maintenance tasks around the cabin. The flowers were in bloom, vibrant against the backdrop of the calm lake, and the vegetable patches thrived in the soft morning light. Each task was done deliberately and carefully, a reflection of the peaceful life they had built over the years. Despite the recent confrontation with HOA Karen, nothing had disturbed the harmony of this place. In fact, the resolution of the dispute had reinforced the protagonist's appreciation for their home and their surroundings. HOA Karen, meanwhile, had not returned. The neighbors had seen her retreat after the revelation of the protagonist's ownership, and there had been no further attempts at interference. The protagonist had expected her to be shocked and perhaps embarrassed, but they had also been prepared for any future encounters. What mattered most was the calm understanding that life continued, and that peace could be maintained without confrontation. Throughout the morning, neighbors wandered past the cabin, some stopping to wave or exchange a few words. There was a sense of admiration in their gestures, an acknowledgement of how the protagonist had handled the situation with dignity and calm. "You handled that so well," one neighbor said quietly, smiling. "I would have been flustered in your place." The protagonist simply nodded, appreciating the kind words but remaining focused on their peaceful routine. They knew that maintaining calm and composure was more important than seeking validation. As the day progressed, the protagonist decided to take a small rowboat out onto the lake. The water was smooth, reflecting the clear blue sky, and the gentle breeze moved across the surface in soft ripples. They let the boat drift slowly, feeling the familiar sense of connection to the lake and the land around them. This was the true reward of the lakeside life, the ability to exist in harmony with nature, to enjoy quiet moments of reflection, and to find joy in simplicity. While floating on the lake, the protagonist thought about HOA Karen and the events that had unfolded. She had been persistent, controlling, and insistent on asserting authority where she had none. But the situation had not escalated into conflict. Instead, patience, clarity, and knowledge of their rights had resolved everything. The protagonist realized that sometimes people act out of misunderstanding or a desire to feel important, and that reacting with anger only gives power to such behavior. Calmness, on the other hand, had proven far stronger. By midday, the protagonist returned to the cabin and prepared a simple lunch. The gentle sounds of the lake and the rustling of leaves in the trees provided a peaceful soundtrack, and the warm sunlight filled the cabin with a soft glow. There was a sense of normalcy restored, a rhythm of life that had been momentarily disrupted but never broken. The protagonist reflected on the lessons of the past days. That patience and understanding were more powerful than confrontation. That knowledge of one's rights provided security, and that true peace could only be maintained through calmness and composure. Neighbors continued to pass by, many stopping to admire the beauty of the lake, or to exchange a few words with the protagonist. There was a quiet respect in these interactions, a recognition of how the protagonist had handled a difficult situation without losing their dignity. Some shared stories of HOA Karen's past assertiveness, expressing relief that the protagonist had navigated the conflict so effectively. Others simply nodded or smiled, enjoying the calm atmosphere that had returned to the neighborhood. As afternoon turned into evening, the protagonist took a walk along the shoreline. The soft sand underfoot, the gentle lapping of water, and the occasional bird call created a sense of timelessness. They walked slowly, reflecting on how life had a way of testing patience and composure, and how those qualities often revealed themselves most clearly in challenging situations. The confrontation with HOA Karen had been one of those tests, and it had ended with understanding, respect, and the reaffirmation of the protagonist's peaceful life. By sunset, the lake was bathed in soft hues of orange, pink, and gold. The protagonist stood at the edge of the water, watching as the sun slowly disappeared behind the distant hills. The reflection of light on the surface created a shimmering path across the lake, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh water. It was a moment of pure serenity, a reminder of why the protagonist had chosen this place as their home. Later, as night fell, the stars appeared in the clear sky, twinkling softly over the calm waters. The protagonist sat on the porch sipping a warm drink and enjoying the quiet of the evening. The lake reflected the stars like a mirror, and the gentle sounds of nature provided a peaceful backdrop. The events with HOA Karen seemed almost surreal now, a brief disturbance in an otherwise tranquil life. The protagonist felt grateful for the calm resolution and for the ability to continue enjoying their home without fear or interruption. In the days that followed, life returned fully to its normal rhythm. The garden flourished, the lake remained serene, and the neighbors continued to pass by, offering smiles and quiet words of respect. HOA Karen did not return, and the protagonist knew that their clear demonstration of ownership and calm composure had put an end to any further disputes. The lesson was simple but profound. Knowledge, patience, and grace could overcome conflict without anger, and true peace was maintained through understanding rather than force. The protagonist also took time to enjoy the smaller joys of daily life. They rowed the boat across the lake, watched the ducks swim, tended to the vegetable patches, and spent quiet evenings by the fireplace reading or reflecting. Each moment was filled with a sense of contentment, a recognition of the life they had carefully cultivated and the peace that surrounded them. Even simple tasks became a source of satisfaction, a reminder of the value of living intentionally and appreciating the present. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood seemed to settle into a gentle rhythm as well. Neighbors continued to respect the boundaries of the protagonist's property, and the story of HOA Karen's failed attempts became a quiet lesson in the importance of understanding and patience. Conversations among neighbors often touched on the incident with a mixture of amusement and respect, and the protagonist's calm handling of the situation became a subtle inspiration for others. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky filled with soft shades of purple and pink, the protagonist reflected on the events of the past week. The confrontation, the arrival of the authorities, and the revelation of their ownership had been unexpected and even challenging, but they had navigated each moment with clarity and composure. The lake, still and shimmering, mirrored the peace that they had maintained throughout. It was a reminder that life's challenges could be met with patience and understanding, and that true resolution came not from confrontation, but from calm and informed action. Finally, the protagonist settled into bed, listening to the soft sounds of the lake and the gentle rustle of leaves outside. The events with HOA Karen had passed, leaving only lessons, reflections, and a renewed appreciation for the life they had built. The cabin remained a sanctuary, the lake a source of endless serenity, and the surrounding land a testament to the rewards of careful stewardship and patience. In the end, the story of the confrontation with HOA Karen became more than just an incident. It was a reminder of the power of calm, knowledge, and composure. The protagonist had faced an unexpected challenge and had emerged not only unshaken but strengthened in their sense of peace and understanding. Life at the lake continued, uninterrupted and beautiful, a testament to the quiet strength of patience and the enduring serenity of nature. As the stars twinkled overhead, reflecting softly on the lake's surface, the protagonist closed their eyes with a sense of satisfaction. The cabin, the lake, and the surrounding land were theirs, secure and peaceful, ready to continue offering the tranquility and joy that had drawn them here in the first place. HOA Karen's interference had been a brief disturbance, a small ripple in the calm waters, but it had ultimately reinforced the beauty and value of a life lived with clarity, patience, and grace. And so the lakeside life continued, as it had always been meant to, peaceful, serene, and full of quiet, enduring joy. The protagonist smiled softly, knowing that no misunderstanding, no misdirected authority, and no moment of tension could ever take away the simple, profound beauty of their home. The lake shimmered under the moonlight. The stars reflected in its gentle ripples, and the cabin stood quietly, a sanctuary of peace, patience, and quiet triumph.